Hello, and welcome to the Dark Ages podcast, episode 52, A Saintly Prince? King Leovigild was having a good run. His military campaigns had forced the various independent statelets around Hispania to subject themselves to him, and this way were paying him tribute in the north. The Franks were mostly absorbed by internal squabbles, and in the south, while the Byzantines remained a concern, there seemed to be no immediate threat there for the time being. Though the fighting would never stop, Leovigild could turn his mind to other things, namely questions of succession, state organization, and finding a way to end the persistent divide in Hispanian society, that between Catholic Hispano-Romans and the Arian Visigothic elites. All of these issues were interrelated, and in 579 they produced violence, when Leovigild's eldest son rebelled against his father and announced his conversion to Orthodoxy. Maybe. The story is obscured by layers of hagiography along with the usual accretions of time, and will give us plenty to chew on in this episode. So the actual circumstances of Prince Hermenegild's revolt and death may be much more complex than the story that's come down to us. We haven't talked about the actual religious differences between the Visigoths and Romans for a while, so I'm going to start by quickly reviewing those issues. I'll tell the story of the revolt as it has come down to us in the sources, and then we'll see what else we can tease out about it. I have said over and over that the Visigoths were Arian Christians, while the Romans were Orthodox Christians. I may have also said Catholic, which at this stage is the same thing, and Nicene, and once in a while Chalcedonian, all of which are also the same thing. By the way, that is Arian with an I, not Arian with a Y, totally different. But what do all of these words actually mean? Well, the split between the two churches, or as the Orthodox would tell you, between the true church and the Arian heresy, arises from a debate among early Christians about the exact relationship between God and Jesus. A wide range of opinions emerged, ranging from the idea that Jesus was wholly human and divinely inspired, to the opinion that Jesus had not actually possessed a human body, only the appearance of one, and was entirely divine, along with a spectrum of opinions in between. It is a complicated question, and that's before you get into the question of the Holy Spirit or Holy Ghost. I'm going to not get dragged too deep into the weeds on this, but it was a matter of active and vigorous debate among early Christians. Amongst the various churches, the Trinitarian model became the most common: Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But that doesn't actually end the argument. Okay, so there are these three different entities, but how are they related? Are they equal? Does the Father have authority over the Son, as he would in an earthly household? Arianism held that the answer to that question was yes. The Father had preceded and created the Son and was therefore the superior being. But the Council of Nicaea decided, among many other things, that this idea was heresy. It declared the Orthodox position that the three limbs of the Trinity were all uncreated, co-equal, and of the same substance. Now, by chance, the missionaries that had converted the Goths had done so before Nicaea, during an upswing in Arianism's popularity, and so the Goths had become and remained Arian Christians, as the empire embraced the Nicene proposition and became Orthodox. As time went on, the empire crumbled and the Goths came to military and political prominence, but the religious divide remained. We have, as far as I know, no reliable sources for the practical exercise of Arian Christianity. No liturgy, no calendars, no clearly differentiated church architecture. So we cannot know how different in practice the two creeds were. We have to assume that 200 or 300 years of development would mean enough divergence for the two to be obviously different by the time of Leovigild, but maybe not. Maybe it was as subtle as the Guelphs and Ghibellines' supposedly different ways of cutting fruit. Tribal animosity has rested on less in human history. Everywhere the Goths came to political prominence, the religion question lurked in the background. Many historians suggest that in spite of the vitriol of the Orthodox chroniclers, it was actually the Arian Goths who were more firmly devoted to their way of doing things, while the Orthodox could be a bit more flexible in pursuit of advantage. Arianism was one of the cultural markers that separated the ruling Goths from the ruled. Remember that it was insufficiently Gothic upbringing of her son that had prompted the rebellion of the Ostrogoths against Amalasuentha, and it's not at all difficult to imagine that there was a religious aspect to that conflict as well. In Hispania, the problem was made manifest in every major city in the question of the bishops. Last time I talked about the increasing importance of municipal loyalty, and simultaneously the growth of the power of the local bishops. Well, every city then had, in theory at least, 2 bishops. The Orthodox bishop with spiritual authority over the majority of the population, and thus a power base, and the Arian bishop with access to the king and aristocracy, and thus a power base. This kind of thing could create tension that could easily get out of hand and was a source of instability in Leovigild's kingdom that he needed to resolve, now that the external threats had been pushed down into quiescence. It was time to try to bridge the gap. Now, there has been a lot of research on the early Visigothic period in the last 25 years, but for some reason it has not had enough time for the conclusions of that research to filter its way into general surveys of the period, which is my way of saying that what you read on Wikipedia is probably out of date. It's also a lot of words for me to work my way around to admitting that the division between Arian and Orthodox may not have been as stark as the chroniclers lead us to believe. Intermarriage was probably becoming more common. Last time I mentioned that Leovigild reformed the laws and legalized marriage between Goths and native inhabitants, and thus, as often as not, between different creeds. I tend to believe that this was both a conscious effort to unify his elite subjects, as well as an acknowledgement of a trend that had been on the upswing for a while anyway. And though I tend to speak of king and nobility as a single block, a lot of that new research focuses on the relationship between a nobility at the periphery in conflict and competition and tension with the central royal power. Wealth and influence was important in that struggle, and as the opportunities for pillaging began to wane, marriage into old wealthy families began to beckon. There was also pressures of competition amongst elite Gothic families amongst themselves, which were another ever-present driver of the search for wealth and status. Likewise, closeness to the military power of the Goths and access to royal influence would have driven the old Hispano-Roman families to seek connections. In spite of the vehemence of their respective bishops, slightly spattered with saliva and denouncing their episcopal rivals, status and wealth still counted for a lot. Conversion usually accompanied marriage, and it seems likely that on balance the process meant more Arians converting to Orthodoxy than vice versa. In 580, Leovigild attempted to make the Arian faith more attractive, both to its lapsed children and to new converts. He convened a synod of all the Arian bishops to discuss reform. They met in Toledo, which was now firmly associated with royal power. The final declarations of the synod do not survive, and so we're forced, again, to rely on the reporting of hostile Orthodox commentators. John of Beclaro reports that the synod declared that should a person convert from Orthodoxy to Arianism, communion from an Arian priest was all that was necessary. No new baptism would be required. That was a kind of lowering of the entrance fee, and implied that the two churches were not as different as the Orthodox clergy presented them. John, who was the Orthodox clergy, declared this to be a deception, a kind of bait and switch. Come on over, it's not really that different, and you'll have the king's favor if you do. That's it, come in. Ha ha, I fooled you, now you're in hell. I exaggerate, of course. There is a suggestion that some softening of the Arian view of the Trinity was also included in the program, for the more theologically minded. John suggests that the changes enticed many to turn away from the Orthodox Church, but given the way things turned out in the next few years, it couldn't have exactly been a flood. The preponderance of evidence is that this softening of the Arian line ultimately only eroded the intellectual appeal of Arianism. If it was so similar, why are we even bothering with it? With all of that as background, then, we come to the story of the rebellious prince. This is a point in the show where I'm afraid I need to introduce some family relationships. Often hard to keep track of, especially in an audio medium, but hang in there. You already know about Leovigild's two sons, Hermenegild and Rekhared. Both of them had been given responsibilities as they had grown up, and were clearly being groomed to take over when Leovigild kicked the bucket. They were the sons of Leovigild's first wife, a woman named Theodosia, but she had died sometime before 570. Leovigild remarried, as widowed men often do, and for his new wife he made a royal choice, the wife of his predecessor, Athanagild, whose name was Goiswintha. It was the kind of legitimizing move we've seen in the past, as a new ruler tries to connect himself to the previous dynasty. In addition to the symbolism, Goiswintha would have had connections and kin relationships among the other Visigothic noble families that would bolster Leovigild's own connections. We often fail to recognize this when discussing political marriages, and they're easy to make fun of in the absence of that consideration. It's rarely mentioned in primary sources, but none of these people were living in bubbles, including the women. They came with a full set of connections and soft influence available. Anyway, Goiswintha had two daughters by Athanagild, both of whom had been married to Frankish kings. Her daughter Brunhilde was married to Sigibert of Austrasia, that's the northeastern part of the Frankish realms, and had 2 daughters, though we're only going to talk about one of them, whose name was Ingund, who was then married to Hermenegild. So, to review the relevant names, because I know that made my eyes cross, Liuvagild is the king. He has 2 sons, the princes Recared and Hermenegild. The king's wife and the prince's stepmother is Goiswintha, and lastly, Hermenegild is married to Ingund, who happens to be his stepmother's granddaughter, and who was raised in a Frankish court. Got it? Here's the story, as it appears in the sources. Ingund was an Orthodox Christian, as were all Frankish royals, so there was bound to be trouble when she arrived in Toledo in 578 or 579 to meet hubby-to-be. Goiswintha treated her warmly at first, but insisted that Ingund be rebaptized as an Arian. You know, this is happening 1 year before the Council of Arian Bishops changed the requirement of conversion. Ingund didn't want to be rebaptized. It would put her soul in danger. Goiswintha insisted. Ingund, all of 12 years old, stood firm. According to Gregory of Tours, Goiswintha lost her temper and beat Ingund savagely, pushing her to the ground and kicking her repeatedly, and then having her thrown into the baptismal pool. Shortly after that nastiness, Liuvagild sent Hermenegild to Seville to act as his viceroy in the south and build up some experience in preparation for becoming king. Ingund obviously went with him, no doubt grateful to escape from her stepmother-in-law/grandmother, and while in Seville, the pair met Leander, the city's Orthodox bishop, and were impressed by him. Leander, by the way, had a younger brother named Isidore, who would later succeed his brother as bishop and do a little writing. Leander and Ingund quickly began collaboration on a project, the conversion of Hermenegild to Orthodoxy. Under the influence of these two, Hermenegild did indeed declare his rejection of Arianism and declared himself in rebellion against his father. It's hard to say for sure, but it seems that Leander and Ingund did their work quickly, and that the declaration of conversion happened shortly after Hermenegild arrived in Seville in 579. Liuvagild probably considered all of this treason, but he was nonetheless in the midst of his church reforms. So at first, there seems to have been little violence, and the whole thing was more of a feud between father and son. And indeed, when violence came, it seems to have been Hermenegild who initiated it. In 583 or 4, he raised Baetica in active revolt and went looking for support from the neighbors, using the religious differences as a justification for his rebellion. He found support from the Suevian king Miro, who mustered an army to march south in support of the rebellion. Liuvagild responded, laid siege to Seville, and turning around and fighting a battle against the Suevi under the walls, in which Miro was killed. The siege of Seville lasted for months, but eventually the city fell and Hermenegild and his family fled to Cordoba. They were met by a small contingent of men sent up from the Byzantine lands, but Liuvagild bribed them, and they withdrew without engaging. Hermenegild was, however, able to send his young wife and daughter with them into safety. Interestingly, no support would be forthcoming from Ingund's Frankish kinsmen, and they're not actually even mentioned. There seems to have been little sympathy for Hermenegild there. When defeat became inevitable, Hermenegild fled to the church, and Liuvagild was not foolish enough to pursue him inside. Instead, he sent in his other son, Recared, to try and find some kind of peaceful settlement with his brother. The two brothers were able to come to an agreement. Hermenegild may have returned to his father's palace in Toledo, or maybe not, but the stories aren't clear. But there was peace for a while. Hermenegild still maintained his Catholicism, and this apparently irritated his stepmother Goiswintha, who worked on Liuvagild to force his son back to the creed of their fathers. But Hermenegild refused to be forced. Eventually the split within the family worsened again, and Hermenegild was imprisoned. There would be no happy reconciliation this time. Hermenegild was killed in prison on his father's orders on the 13th of April, 585. Afterward, as the murdered prince waited for burial, the songs of invisible singers could be heard near his body, and after he was taken away, strange lights were seen in the place where he was laid. Thus he was declared a martyr to the Catholic faith and revered as a saint not long afterwards. So that's the story more or less, as distilled from a few sources. It appears in Gregory of Tours' Histories, John of Biclaro's Chronicle, and very briefly in Isidore of Seville. The most influential version of the story, though, appears in the Dialogues of Pope Gregory I, written about 593. Only in Gregory's account is Hermenegild presented as a martyr for the faith. Isidore barely mentions the rebellion at all. John, who is probably closest to the events, does not mention religion at all as a factor in the rebellion, nor does he explicitly blame Liuvagild for his son's death. He merely relates that Hermenegild was killed by Sigebert in the city of Tarraco. Who Sigebert was, whether an official executioner or hired thug, if there is a difference, is unknown. Gregory of Tours does indicate that religion drove Hermenegild's rebellion, but even he doesn't go so far as to call Hermenegild a martyr or paint him as a hero. Even to the fanatically anti-Arian Gregory, the son's disloyalty to the father was too great a sin to make the prince heroic. So it was left to the Pope Gregory to lionize Hermenegild, crediting him with paving the way for the conversion of the Visigoths in the coming reign of his brother. Because that's where this is all heading. Gregory pointed to John 12:24 as the relevant text. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces a lot of grain. Hermenegild remained on the roll call of martyrs through the Middle Ages, his prominence helped by Gregory, but never in the first rank of saints, until the Reconquista began to gather steam in the 13th and 14th century. Once the reconquest of Hispania was complete, interest grew in the golden age of the Visigoths that existed before the Moorish invasion, and Hermenegild's popularity peaked in the 17th century. He still gives his name to the Royal and Military Order of St. Hermenegild, which remains the highest decoration for the Spanish military to this day. The absence of the religious angle from the closest observers makes the question worth asking. What was really going on here? It's possible that Hermenegild was indeed influenced by the Orthodox Bishop Leander, and rejected his father's Arianism. It's possible such a course would have been quite irritating to Liuvigild, given that he was actively attempting to make Arianism more acceptable. It's hard to date Hermenegild's rebellion specifically, but the fall of Seville came in either 583 or 584, after a siege that lasted months. Coming so quickly after Liuvigild's church council in 580, it would make sense for the king to be a bit touchy about religious issues at the time. But I'm not sure that it's enough, frankly. It seems deeply counterproductive to brutally pursue and murder an apostate's son at the same time one is trying to sell the benefits of conversion to a reluctant populace, and Liuvigild strikes one as a canny old bird. The charges of persecution the chroniclers level against him are never very specific and feel a little rote, so I'm inclined to agree with Michael Collins, my guiding light in all things Visigoth, that there's more going on here than just a religious spat. Especially notable to me is the intervention of outside powers. Both the Suevi and Byzantines make their appearance in the story. Both most likely came hoping to exploit divisions in the Visigothic state, and both found out that it was too late for that. The death of King Miro, below the walls of Seville, sent the Suevic kingdom into another spasm of internal conflict that ended half a decade later when Liuvigild casually invaded in 585 and forced them to submit to his direct rule. The death of the kingdom of the Suevi seems almost incidental to the rebellion of Hermenegild, and their integration into the Visigoths Hispania was apparently swift and complete. Though many have tried, no clearly identifiable cultural traits have survived to the present day. Whatever remained seemed to have been swept away by the Muslim invasions of the 8th century. So, farewell, Suevi, we hardly knew thee. The appearance of the Byzantines is actually more puzzling than it appears at first glance. In all of the Byzantine interventions we've seen, support for the anointed ruler has been the excuse, the thin edge of the wedge. We saw it in Africa, Italy, and most recently even in Hispania, if our interpretation of Liberius's expedition is correct. So it would seem out of character for the Byzantines to come to the aid of a rebel, even a co-religionist rebel. It may be that this is opportunism, which would also explain how Liuvigild was able to deal with them so easily, by bribery. It may have been more Byzantine, though, if you'll forgive the pun. With Hermenegild sent by his father to the south to run things, the Byzantines may have made contact with him and incited the rebellion themselves. Hermenegild was young and may have had his head turned by promises of support and increased power for himself. It's also possible that Ingund, Hermenegild's wife, may have had more political influence than appears at first. She may have been whispering in her husband's ear not just about religion, but that he should really have more independence from his father. Who knows? Maybe she was a channel for Byzantine influence. We shouldn't fall into the medieval misogynist trap of assigning blame for all evil scheming to women, but neither should we go so far in the other direction and assume that noble women were powerless or without agency. Ingund had reason to be resentful at the way she had been treated at Liuvigild's court, and it's possible she may have put ideas into Hermenegild's head. Absolutely all of that is speculation, and the truth is probably unknowable. Normally, I try not to be too cynical about these things, but in this case, I tend to believe that Hermenegild's rebellion was motivated more by a misguided search for personal power than by religious feeling. Likewise, my guess is that Hermenegild was successful enough in attracting support, both of outside powers and probably Visigothic nobles looking for a bit more independence, and that meant that he could ultimately not be left alive. An apostate prince could maybe be isolated and reasoned with. A political threat and leader had to be dealt with. And so Hermenegild's execution in prison, not in public note, became unnecessary evil. It would not surprise me one little bit if there were religious differences between father and son, which is enough of a peg for Pope Gregory to hang a martyr's hat on a decade later. Gregory was a masterful writer and advocate of the faith who probably deserves his own episode, and he was canny enough to recognize a useful story that he could spin for his own purpose when he saw one. In the long run, the ultimate beneficiary of Hermenegild's rebellion was his younger brother, Recared, who now had a clear path to the throne and sole rule. He wouldn't have long to wait. On April 21st, 586, just about a year after the death of his son, Liuvigild died in his bed in Toledo. He had been sole king of the Visigoths for 14 years. Under his leadership, Hispania had been united under a single ruler, and central authority had been established. Only the Byzantine province remained apart. His was the authority of violence and unity by conquest, but there probably was no other way it could have been achieved. Recared was acclaimed king immediately and without rancor by the Visigothic nobility. Whatever divisions had existed thanks to Hermenegild's disloyalty were forgotten. In the light of such clear support, Recared made a decision that would be the final stone in the foundation his father had laid for a true successor to the Roman Empire. He declared his acceptance of the Orthodox faith and rejected Arianism. It was the watershed moment of the history of Visigothic Spain, and we will talk more about it next time. Speaking of next time and programming and plans, the next episode will be the last in our current series on the Visigoths, since it will bring us nearly up to the end of the 6th century, and we have gotten a bit ahead of everywhere else as we've gone along. So 2 episodes from now, I plan to do a little in-between episode on a people who have been around in the background of all of our talk about Hispania and Aquitaine, the Basques. And then it's probably time to take the plunge and find our way through the mire of the Merovingian dynasty and what's been happening in Francia all this time, and who knows how long that will take us to untangle. So, as you can see, there's plenty of material for us to talk about going forward. For now, it only remains for me to thank you for listening, for commenting on Spotify or rating and reviewing on whatever app you use, and especially a heartfelt thank you to the heroes who still offer their support on Ko-Fi.com. Genuinely, you have kept this podcast alive. Have a happy and safe new year, everyone. I will speak to you again in 2025, and until then, take care.